There is a house at 10640 Belagio Road in Los Angeles that does not belong to the world of ordinary mortals. It sprawls across the hilltop of Bel Air like a marble monument to an ancient empire. 40,000 square feet of Georgian grandeur, built in an age when America was starving and one widow decided the laws of gravity, economic, moral, or architectural, did not apply to her. This is the story of Casa Encantada, the Enchanted House. Not the story you might have glimpsed in glossy real estate magazines or heard whispered in society columns, but the darker, stranger truth of how a palace built to prove social worth instead became a machine for destroying families. 2 owners, 2 dynasties, both ground to dust within these walls. The mansion still stands today, priced at $250 million, the most expensive residential listing in American history. But its real cost cannot be calculated in currency. 3 people are dead because of what this house represented. 1 died at 42, his heart destroyed by alcohol and the weight of impossible expectations. Another died at 67, penniless, her body unclaimed in a Los Angeles morgue, while her surname glittered on hotel facades across 6 continents. The third lived to 91, built a global empire, and left behind a charitable foundation that saves millions of lives. Yet he could not save his own children. This is a story about what money cannot buy. It is about the invisible walls that separate old wealth from new, about the difference between a house and a home, about the American religion of success and the human casualties it demands. Casa Encantada was cursed from the day its foundation was poured, not by spirits or supernatural forces, but by something far more dangerous: the belief that greatness in architecture or business can substitute for greatness in love. If you value deep investigations into the hidden histories of American wealth, the psychological architecture of power, and the invisible structures that shape dynasties, please like this video and subscribe. Your support makes these detailed explorations possible. Now let us enter the gates of the most expensive emotional disaster in Los Angeles history. 1. The nurse who built a palace. While America starved, 1936, bread lines stretched around city blocks. The unemployment rate hovered near 25%. Dust storms turned farmland to desert. Families lived in cars. Children went to bed hungry. The average American household, if they were lucky enough to have income, earned about $1,500 per year. On a hilltop in Los Angeles, construction crews were pouring concrete for a residential palace that would cost $2 million. Do the arithmetic. At a time when $1,500 represented a year of labor, someone was spending $2,000 on a single house. In modern terms, accounting for both inflation and the exponential increase in luxury real estate values, this translates to over $40 million. For context, that amount in 1936 could have fed 50,000 families for a year. The woman writing the checks was named Hilda Bolt Weber. You have never heard of her. History forgot her deliberately, the way society forgets people who try too hard. But to understand how Casa Encantada became a curse, you must first understand her wound. Hilda was not born to silk and champagne. She was born to work. In the early 1900s, she earned her living as a nurse in Cincinnati, Ohio. This was noble labor, necessary labor, but it marked her. In the rigid social hierarchy of the American upper class at that time, nurses occupied a specific rung: service. Respectable service, yes, but service nonetheless. You did not marry a nurse if you wanted to preserve your bloodline's pedigree. You did not invite a nurse to the country club for tennis. Then Hilda's fortune changed in the most American way possible. She married up. Her husband was Charles Bolt, a glass magnate whose factories produced the bottles that held America's beverages. Bolt was successful, wealthy, and most importantly, established. When he died suddenly in 1929, just months before the stock market collapsed and took half the country's wealth with it, He left Hilda one of the largest personal fortunes in the Midwest. She was instantly transformed, no longer a nurse, now a widow, a very rich widow. But money alone does not grant admission to the world Hilda craved. The social elite of Cincinnati looked at her bank account and shrugged. They knew where she came from. At garden parties and charity galas, the other women smiled with their mouths, while their eyes remained cold. Invitations arrived late or not at all. When she entered a room, conversations did not stop, but they shifted, slightly, almost imperceptibly, just enough to let her know she was tolerated but not welcomed. This is the psychology that built Casa Encantada. Not love, not artistic vision. Revenge. Hilda made a decision. If the old world would not accept her, she would create a new world and make them beg for entry. She would build something so magnificent, so overwhelming, that it would erase the memory of her origins. She would commission a palace that would force society to bow. In 1934, she packed everything and moved west to Los Angeles. California in the 1930s was still inventing itself. Hollywood had created a new aristocracy based not on family names that traced back to the Mayflower, but on beauty, talent, and box office receipts. Money talked louder here. Pedigree mattered less. The old rules were negotiable. Hilda purchased a plot of land at the peak of Bel Air, a recently developed enclave carved into the Santa Monica Mountains. The location was not accidental. The property sat at one of the highest points, visible from miles away, dominating the landscape. Geography as metaphor. She would literally look down on Los Angeles. For the architect, she hired James Dolina, a man whose clients included film stars and studio executives. Dolina understood that in Los Angeles, architecture was theater. Buildings were not just structures, they were statements. But even Dolina, experienced in the demands of the wealthy and vain, was taken aback by Hilda's instructions. She did not want comfort, she wanted scale. She did not want a home, she wanted a monument. The design Dolina produced was Georgian Revival, an architectural style that evoked 18th century English aristocracy. This choice was deliberate, no Spanish colonial, which was ubiquitous in California. No Art Deco modernism. Hilda wanted her house to look like it had been transplanted from the English countryside, where dukes and earls lived in inherited estates. She wanted the aesthetic of old money, ancient legitimacy, unquestionable class. The plans called for 64 rooms spread across nearly 40,000 square feet. The main structure would be arranged in an H shape, ensuring that light flooded every room while also creating the long, echoing corridors that suggested institutional grandeur. There would be multiple wings, each large enough to be a standalone mansion. Guest quarters that exceeded the size of normal family homes. Servants' quarters that could house a staff of 30. Construction began in 1936. The crews worked through the Depression, one of the few large-scale private construction projects in California. While the nation suffered, Hilda Weber's palace rose. The foundation alone required months. The hillside had to be graded and reinforced. Retaining walls were built to hold back the earth. The structure had to be earthquake-resistant, a relatively new engineering concern in California. Tons of steel were driven into bedrock. The exterior walls were brick, covered in white stucco, smoothed to a finish that glowed in the California sun. The symmetry was obsessive. Every window had a twin, every column was balanced by another. The roofline was flat and severe, punctuated by balustrades that gave the impression of a palace where guards might once have stood watch. For the interiors, Hilda hired a designer whose name would later become legend, T.H. Robsjohn Gibbings. This was his first major American commission, and he approached it with the fervor of a missionary. Robsjohn Gibbings despised antiques. He called them the corpses of dead taste. He believed that modern design should look to ancient Greece and Rome, bypassing the clutter of centuries in between. Everything in Casa Encantada would be new, but designed to feel eternal. Every piece of furniture was custom-made for a specific room. Chairs with legs carved to resemble lion paws and Greek columns. Tables constructed from rare woods imported from Asia and South America. Fabrics woven in Europe to match the exact color palettes of each space. The wood used throughout the house was English walnut, so dark it absorbed light, creating an atmosphere of gravitas and weight. The main entrance hall featured floors of black and white marble arranged in a checkerboard pattern. The ceiling soared 12 feet high. A crystal chandelier, custom-made in France, hung at the center, its prisms casting fractured rainbows across the walls. The staircase curved upward in a gentle arc, designed so that anyone descending appeared to float. The dining room could seat 24 people at a single mahogany table. The chairs were upholstered in silk. Silver candlesticks, 12 inches tall, stood at precise intervals. The room was designed not for intimate family meals, but for diplomatic banquets. The library was entirely paneled in that dark English walnut. The smell of the wood, rich, slightly sweet, ancient, dominated the senses. Bookshelves reached from floor to ceiling. Leather-bound volumes, many of them decorative rather than read, filled the shelves. This was a room designed to intimidate. You entered and immediately felt the weight of history, real or imagined, pressing down. The master suite occupied an entire wing. Bedroom, sitting room, dressing rooms, bathrooms clad in Italian marble. The bathtub was carved from a single block of stone. The windows offered views of the city below, sprawling toward the ocean. Outside, the grounds were equally ambitious. Formal gardens were laid out in geometric patterns. Hedges were trimmed into perfect rectangles. A swimming pool, 60 feet long, was built with a pool house that contained changing rooms, a full kitchen, and a lounge area larger than most American living rooms. Tennis courts, stables, though Hilda did not ride. The property was designed to accommodate any activity a person of leisure might desire. And beneath it all, hidden from view, ran something truly extraordinary, an underground tunnel. This passage connected the Casa Encantada grounds directly to the adjacent Bel Air Country Club. The tunnel allowed Hilda, and later other owners, to move between house and club without ever stepping onto a public street. No risk of encountering the unwashed masses, no photographers, no reality. The house was completed in 1938. The final cost exceeded the original estimate, though Hilda never publicly disclosed the exact figure. Estimates place it at approximately $2.5 million, which today would equal somewhere north of $50 million, depending on how you calculate luxury inflation. Hilda Weber threw open the doors. She hosted parties. The guest lists included Hollywood stars, directors, producers, a few politicians. The Los Angeles Times Society pages covered the events. Photographs showed women in gowns and men in tuxedos standing in rooms that looked like museum galleries. But something was wrong. The house was too perfect. It overwhelmed its inhabitants. Guests arrived, marveled, and left. But they did not linger. They did not relax. Casa Encantada was spectacular, but it was not welcoming. It was a stage set, not a living space. And Hilda, wandering through her 64 rooms, began to realize her mistake. She had built a monument to prove she belonged. But belonging is not something you can construct from marble and walnut. The Cincinnati Society matrons who had snubbed her were not impressed. They were 3,000 miles away and did not care. The Hollywood elite who attended her parties admired the house, but did not admire her. She remained what she had always been, an outsider who had bought a ticket but could not change the fact that she did not speak the language of the tribe. Casa Encantada had cost her a fortune, but it had not bought her the one thing she wanted, acceptance. Worse, the house was bleeding her dry. Maintaining a property of that scale required an army. Gardeners, housekeepers, cooks, chauffeurs, maintenance staff. The monthly expenses ran into tens of thousands of dollars. Hilda's fortune, though large, was not infinite, and she had another vice: gambling. She loved the tables at the private clubs. She lost heavily and often. By the mid-1940s, Hilda Weber was in financial trouble. The palace was becoming a prison. She had built it to prove her worth, and now it was consuming her. In 1948, she made the decision. Casa Encantada went on the market. The asking price, $1.5 million. A loss even by the standards of the day, considering what she had invested. But nobody wanted it. The house sat empty, its rooms echoing, its gardens growing wild as the staff was reduced. The price dropped. $1.2 million, then $1 million, then $700,000, then $500,000. Hilda Weber, the woman who had built the most expensive house in Los Angeles to escape her past, was now trapped by her creation. The house would not sell. Her fortune dwindled. She became desperate. And then, at her lowest point, a buyer appeared. A man who had also been rejected by society, who had also built an empire to prove his worth, who understood exactly what Casa Encantada represented because he had spent his life constructing monuments to his own need for validation. His name was Conrad Hilton, and he was about to make the house's curse his own. 2. The Texan who bought someone else's dream for a fraction of its soul, 1950. While Hilda Weber sat in her palace, fielding calls from creditors, Conrad Nicholson Hilton was at the peak of his power. His face had appeared on the cover of Time magazine. The headline called him Innkeeper to the World. This was not hyperbole. In October 1949, Hilton had closed the deal that would define his legacy, the purchase of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. The Waldorf was not just a hotel. It was an institution, a symbol of elegance and power, the place where presidents stayed, where international treaties were signed, where American aristocracy, such as it was, gathered. For a man born in the dust of New Mexico Territory, the son of a shopkeeper, this was the ultimate validation. But Conrad Hilton was not satisfied. He never was. Satisfaction was not in his vocabulary. His philosophy was simple and ruthless: expand or die. By 1950, his hotel empire stretched from coast to coast. He was preparing to expand internationally. His vision was global domination of the hospitality industry. But he had a problem. He had no real home. Hilton lived in hotels. His life was suitcases and room service. He slept in one city and woke in another. This was efficient, certainly. But it was also an admission. A man who owned 100 hotels but no house was a man who had conquered the world of strangers but remained a stranger to himself. His personal life reflected this emptiness. He had been married and divorced twice. His first wife, Mary Barron, had given him 3 sons: Conrad Jr., Nicky, Barron, and Eric. The marriage fell apart under the pressure of Hilton's relentless ambition. His second marriage to the flamboyant Hungarian actress Zsa Gabor was a disaster from the start. It lasted 5 years and produced one daughter, Francesca, before ending in acrimony. Zsa later described Conrad as stingy and cold. She claimed he would wake at dawn to pray, then spend the rest of the day calculating profits. Hilton was aware of his reputation. He was known as a brilliant businessman but a failure at human connection. He compensated by doubling down on the only thing he knew how to do: build. And when he learned that Casa Encantada, the most expensive house in Los Angeles, was languishing on the market, he saw an opportunity. Not an opportunity to create a home, an opportunity to acquire an asset. The negotiations were brief and brutal. Hilda Weber was desperate. Her asking price had dropped to $500,000. Hilton offered $225,000. This was an insult. This was less than 1/10 of what she had spent building the place. It was barely more than the value of the land itself, but Hilda had no leverage. creditors were circling. She accepted. The contract included one more humiliation. Hilton demanded that the sale be lock, stock, and barrel. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every fork and knife, every towel in the linen, closets, all of it stayed. Hilda Weber walked out of Casa Encantada in 1950 with a single suitcase of personal belongings. Everything she had commissioned, everything that bore her taste and her mark, now belonged to Conrad Hilton. This was the moment the house passed from one curse to another. Hilton's purchase of Casa Encantada in 1950 coincided with another event that seemed, on the surface, to be a triumph: the marriage of his eldest son, Nicky, to Elizabeth Taylor. The wedding took place on May 6, 1950, at the Church of the Good Shepherd in Beverly Hills. Elizabeth was 18 years old, staggeringly beautiful, already a star. Nicky was 23, handsome, charming, the heir to the Hilton empire. The wedding was a media spectacle. MGM Studios, which had Elizabeth under contract, paid for everything and treated it as a publicity event. 3,000 guests attended the reception. Elizabeth wore a gown that cost $3,500. The cake was 6 feet tall. The event was broadcast on radio. America watched the wedding of the year. Conrad Hilton stood in the receiving line, shaking hands, his face a mask of pride. This marriage, he believed, was the final seal of legitimacy. His family name was now linked to Hollywood royalty. The Hiltons were no longer just rich, they were glamorous. But the marriage was a catastrophe from the beginning. During the honeymoon in Europe, Nicky drank heavily. He gambled. He was cruel. Elizabeth later recounted that he would disappear for days, leaving her alone in hotel suites. He was physically abusive. By the time they returned to America, Elizabeth was emotionally shattered. The marriage was annulled in January 1951, less than 8 months after the wedding. Conrad Hilton never publicly acknowledged his son's failures, but privately he drew a conclusion. Nicky was weak. The boy had been given everything: money, name, opportunity, and had squandered it. This confirmed Conrad's deepest fear, that inherited wealth destroyed character. So Conrad retreated into the one place where he felt in control: Casa Encantada. He moved into the mansion at the end of 1950, just as his son's marriage was disintegrating. The house became his command center. He converted one of the guest bedrooms into an office, installing multiple phone lines, filing cabinets, and a desk the size of a conference table. From this room, he would manage an empire spanning continents. But Conrad Hilton's relationship with the house was transactional, not emotional. He did not redecorate. He kept Hilda Weber's furniture, not out of respect, but out of efficiency. It worked. Why replace it? He kept the staff, the routines, the systems. Casa Encantada became the headquarters of Hilton Hotels Corporation West Coast operations. Business meetings were held in the library. Dinners with investors took place in the dining room. The house was a tool, and his children? They were guests in their own home. Nicky, after the divorce, descended into alcoholism. He lived in hotels, drifting. Baron, the middle son, joined the company and became his father's shadow, dutiful and silent. Eric, the youngest of the first marriage, stayed in the background, and Francesca, the daughter from the Zsa marriage, visited occasionally, awkward and out of place. The dynamic that developed in Casa Encantada during the 1950s set the template for the family's destruction. Conrad was physically present but emotionally absent. He loved his children in the abstract. He wanted them to succeed. But he had no idea how to show affection. He could not relax. He could not play. Every interaction became a lesson in discipline and economics. Dinner at Casa Encantada was served at 6 p.m. sharp, no exceptions. The dining room, with its long mahogany table and gilded mirrors, was silent except for the clink of silverware. Conrad sat at the head. If one of the children was late, their seat remained empty, the untouched plate a silent rebuke. Conversation was formal, business was discussed, personal feelings were not. The house enforced this coldness. The architecture of Casa Encantada was not designed for warmth. The ceilings were too high, the rooms were too large. Voices echoed, the spaces between people felt physical. A child sitting in the library could feel utterly alone, even if their father was just 10 feet away. Francesca Hilton, in later interviews, described her visits to Casa Encantada with a mix of awe and dread. She remembered walking through the entrance hall, her footsteps loud on the marble, feeling like an intruder. She remembered her father handing her checks instead of hugs. She remembered Christmas mornings when the tree glittered with lights, but the presents felt transactional. A check for $100, a check for $500. Never a gift chosen with thought. Always money, as if affection could be calculated and dispersed. Conrad Hilton believed he was teaching his children the value of self-reliance. He saw wealthy families destroyed by lazy heirs. He was determined that his children would not be spoiled. But there is a difference between discipline and deprivation. Conrad could not see that line, or perhaps he could, and he simply did not care. His metric for success was professional achievement. Emotional health was not on the spreadsheet. By the mid-1950s, Casa Encantada had settled into its identity as a machine. It functioned perfectly. The staff kept it spotless. The gardens were manicured. The pool sparkled. But the house was not alive. It was a museum that people happened to sleep in. And Conrad, now in his 60s, began to feel the weight of mortality. He had built an empire, but he had no heir worthy of it, at least not in his eyes. Nicky was a failure. Baron was competent but uninspiring. Eric was invisible. Francesca was a girl, and Conrad, a product of his time, could not imagine a woman running a business empire. The question began to form in Conrad's mind. What would happen to all this when he died? The answer he arrived at, slowly and methodically over the next 2 decades, would be his final act of control. It would also destroy what remained of his family. But before that reckoning, Casa Encantada would bear witness to one more tragedy. The death of the Golden Boy, the end of Nicky Hilton, and the moment when Conrad's philosophy would be tested and would fail in the most brutal way imaginable. 3. The Golden Boy who drowned in his father's shadow. There are certain kinds of pain that wealth cannot numb. Nicky Hilton learned this the hard way. He was born with everything: looks, money, a famous name. He was tall, over 6 feet, with dark hair and blue eyes. He had his father's charm, but none of his father's iron. He was soft where Conrad was hard, human where Conrad was corporate. And that made him unforgivable in his father's eyes. Nicky's life after the Elizabeth Taylor disaster became a slow-motion collapse. He tried to work in the family business. Conrad gave him positions, titles, offices. But everyone knew they were sinecures. Nicky showed up late. He left early. He was disengaged. The work bored him. The relentless pressure to perform, to prove himself worthy of the name, crushed him. So he drank. And when the drinking did not dull the pain enough, he gambled. He spent his nights in the casinos of Las Vegas and Monaco, running up debts that his father quietly paid off. Each bailout came with a lecture. Each lecture pushed Nicky further away. The cruelty of Conrad's philosophy was its internal logic. He believed that coddling destroyed men. He believed that hardship built character. Therefore, the more Nicky struggled, the more Conrad withdrew support, thinking he was teaching a lesson. But the lesson Nicky learned was different. I am not enough. I will never be enough. Nicky married again and again. 4 marriages in total, each ending in divorce. He was searching for something, stability, love, validation, that he could not name. Women were drawn to him. He was charming when sober, witty, generous. But the darkness always returned. He would disappear for days. He would drink until he blacked out. He would wake in hotel rooms he did not remember checking into. By the 1960s, Nicky's body was failing. His liver was scarred. His heart was weak. He was only in his 30s, but he looked 50. The Hollywood friends who had partied with him in the 1950s now avoided him. He was embarrassing. He was a cautionary tale. Conrad watched all of this from Casa Encantada. Father and son rarely spoke. When they did, the conversations were terse. Conrad did not ask about Nicky's health. He asked about business, which Nicky had long since stopped pretending to care about. The emotional wall between them was complete. On February 5, 1969, Nicky Hilton died of a heart attack. He was 42 years old. The official cause was cardiac arrest, but the real cause was 2 decades of self-destruction. His body, ravaged by alcohol and stress, simply gave out. Conrad Hilton attended the funeral at Holy Cross Cemetery in Culver City. He stood beside the grave, his face impassive. Witnesses later reported that he did not cry. He stood stiff and formal while his eldest son was lowered into the ground. What was he thinking? Did he feel guilt? Did he wonder if his parenting had contributed to Nicky's destruction? Or did he see his son's death as confirmation of his worldview, that weakness was weakness regardless of its cause, and that the world had no obligation to coddle the fragile? We do not know. Conrad Hilton left no diary, no confessional letters. But his actions after Nicky's death speak volumes. Within weeks, he was back at his desk in Casa Encantada, working. He did not slow down. He did not reevaluate his life. He doubled down. And somewhere in the recesses of his mind, a decision solidified. If money had destroyed Nicky, then money was poison. And the only way to save his remaining children from the same fate was to take the poison away. This is the origin of the will, the infamous will that would, a decade later, disinherit his children and make headlines around the world. Conrad Hilton began planning his estate in the late 1960s in the shadow of Nicky's death. The logic, as he saw it, was airtight. He had spent his life building the Hilton empire. That empire had value beyond money. It created jobs. It contributed to the economy. It provided a service. But more than that, Hilton was a devout Catholic. He attended Mass daily at St. Paul's Church in Westwood. He believed in charity, in the moral obligation of the wealthy to help the poor. He looked at the suffering in the world, starving children, disease, war, and believed his fortune could make a difference. His children, on the other hand, had done nothing to earn their inheritance. They had been born into privilege. They had squandered opportunities. Nicky was dead. Barron was competent but hardly visionary. Francesca was, in Conrad's view, a dilettante. None of them had built anything. Why should they inherit what they did not earn? So Conrad made his choice. He would leave his fortune to the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation, a charitable organization he had established in 1944. The foundation would use the money to help those who truly needed it. This, Conrad believed, was justice. This was morality. This was the right thing to do. He drafted the will meticulously. He consulted with lawyers, accountants, religious advisors. He wanted no ambiguity. When he died, 97% of his estate would go to the foundation. The remaining 3% would be divided among his children, with the bulk going to Barron, who ran the company. Francesca would receive $100,000, a token, a symbolic acknowledgement that she was his daughter, but nothing more. Conrad Hilton signed the document and filed it away. He did not discuss it with his children. He saw no need. The decision was made. His legacy was secure. The money would do good in the world, far more good than it would do in the hands of his heirs. But he miscalculated one thing: the depth of the wound this would inflict. Not the financial wound. His children were already wealthy in relative terms, but the emotional one. The message the will sent was clear. You are not worthy. Strangers deserve my fortune more than you do. And Casa Encantada, the house that was supposed to represent the family's triumph, became the symbol of their abandonment. Because when Conrad died, the house would be sold. His children would not inherit it. They would be evicted from the only place that bore any connection to their father. The house, already cold, was about to become a tomb. 4. The death of the patriarch and the will that destroyed a dynasty. January 3, 1979. St. John's Hospital, Santa Monica. Conrad Nicholson Hilton took his last breath at 11:42 a.m. He was 91 years old, for over 6 decades he had been a force of nature, a man who bent industries and people to his will. Now, in a sterile hospital room, surrounded by machines and nurses, he died. The news spread quickly. Within hours, it was on the evening broadcasts. Hotel magnate Conrad Hilton dead at 91. The obituaries praised his achievements. Visionary, titan, philanthropist, the man who built a global empire from a single hotel in Texas. But in the offices of his lawyers and in the living rooms of his children, a different story was unfolding. The reading of the will. Baron Hilton, now 51 years old, had been running Hilton Hotels Corporation for years. He expected to inherit control, if not the fortune. Eric, the youngest son from the first marriage, expected something. Francesca, now 32, had been estranged from her father for years, but she was still his daughter. She expected acknowledgement, at least. What they got was a slap across the face. The will was read by the executors in a law office in downtown Los Angeles. The language was precise and cold. Conrad Hilton's estate, valued at approximately $200 million, close to $1 billion in today's terms, would be distributed as follows. 97% to the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation, approximately $194 million. The remainder, roughly $6 million, would be divided among trusts, minor bequests, and his children. Baron received the largest share, around $3 million, along with control of certain company assets. Eric received a smaller amount. Francesca received $100,000. $100,000 from an estate worth $200 million. The silence in that room must have been deafening. Francesca later described feeling as though the floor had dropped away beneath her. She had known her father was cold, distant, impossible to please. But this was beyond coldness. This was erasure. Baron's reaction was different. He was angry, not just at the financial loss, though that was significant, but at the threat this posed to the company. The foundation now owned the majority of Conrad's shares in Hilton Hotels Corporation. Under U.S. law at the time, a charitable foundation could not hold such a large stake in a for-profit company indefinitely. The foundation would be required to sell those shares within a certain period. This meant the company could be vulnerable to takeover. Corporate raiders could swoop in. Competitors could buy control. The empire Conrad had spent his life building could be torn apart. Baron made a decision. He would fight, not to overturn the entire will. That would be impossible, and it would look like greed. But he would fight for control of the company. He hired a team of lawyers and filed suit, arguing that the estate should be restructured to protect the business. The legal battle lasted 9 years. From 1979 to 1988, the Hilton family and the Hilton Foundation were locked in litigation. It was ugly. Family secrets were aired in court. Financial records were subpoenaed. Depositions revealed the dysfunction, the resentment, the decades of emotional neglect. And through it all, Casa Encantada sat empty. The house where Conrad had ruled, where he had made his final plans, was now just an asset on a balance sheet. In 1980, the executors put it up for sale. The asking price was $12.4 million. This was the highest price ever asked for a private residence in the United States at that time. The house was still a record breaker, even in abandonment. The buyer was David Murdoch, a self-made billionaire with interests in real estate, agriculture, and corporate takeovers. Murdoch paid the asking price. He walked through the 64 rooms and saw potential, but not the potential to preserve history. He saw the potential to erase it and build something new. Murdoch hated the interiors. He found them dark, oppressive, old-fashioned. The English walnut paneling, the heavy draperies, the Robs John Gibbings furniture, all of it had to go. He gutted the house. Walls were torn down. The wood paneling was ripped out or painted over. The custom furniture was auctioned off, scattered to collectors and dealers. Murdoch rebuilt Casa Encantada in his own image. He wanted light, open spaces, modern aesthetics. He installed new kitchens, new bathrooms, new everything. The house that Hilda Weber had built and Conrad Hilton had inhabited was obliterated. Only the shell remained. The Hilton family watched this happen from a distance. They had no claim to the house, no legal standing. They could only watch as their history was demolished. Francesca Hilton, meanwhile, was struggling. $100,000, even in 1979, was not enough to live on for long, not in Los Angeles. She tried to build a career as an actress and comedian. She performed in small clubs, making jokes about being the poor little rich girl. The irony was bitter. Her last name opened doors, but it also created expectations she could not meet. Bookers wanted her because she was a Hilton. Audiences expected glamour. But Francesca had no money for glamour. She lived in small apartments. She drove an old car. She struggled to pay rent. Her mother, Zia Gabor, was no help. Zia, now in her 60s, was still performing the role of the fabulous star, living beyond her means, cycling through husbands. She and Francesca had a complicated relationship marked by mutual disappointment. Francesca was alone, and she was drowning. In 1988, Baron Hilton finally won his legal battle. The court approved a settlement that allowed him to retain control of Hilton Hotels Corporation. The foundation would receive cash and other assets over time, but Baron kept the company. He had saved his father's empire. It should have been a triumph. But the cost was incalculable. 9 years of litigation, millions spent on legal fees, a family fractured beyond repair. Francesca had not been part of the legal fight. She was a footnote, a bystander in the battle over her father's fortune. Baron, now firmly in control, rebuilt the company. Over the next 2 decades, he expanded the brand, increased profits, and made the Hilton name even more ubiquitous. He became a billionaire in his own right. He played poker with Warren Buffett. He owned sports teams. He lived in a mansion in Las Vegas. And then, in 2007, Baron Hilton made an announcement that shocked the family and the business world. He declared that he would follow in his father's footsteps. He would leave 97% of his personal fortune, estimated at $2.3 billion, to the Conrad and Hilton Foundation. The curse had come full circle. Baron had spent 9 years fighting his father's will, only to recreate it. He had internalized the lesson. Family inheritance was dangerous. Charity was noble. His own children and his famous granddaughter, Paris Hilton, whose name had become synonymous with celebrity and excess, would not inherit his billions. The same logic, the same wound, the same cold calculation. The Hilton dynasty, built on ambition and discipline, had eaten itself. 2 generations of patriarchs, both convinced that money destroyed character, had systematically disinherited their heirs. They had built empires, but they had demolished families. And Casa Encantada, the house that had started it all, stood on its hill, renovated and resold, occupied by strangers who knew nothing of the curse embedded in its walls. 5. The Forgotten Daughter and the Final Cruelty of the Enchanted House. Francesca Hilton spent the last 2 decades of her life invisible. This was the ultimate irony. Her surname was written on buildings in every major city on earth, but she lived in obscurity and poverty. After her father's death and the will reading, Francesca tried to build a life. She took acting classes. She performed stand-up comedy at open mic nights in small clubs. Her act was built around self-deprecating humor. "I'm the heir to the Hilton fortune." Unfortunately, the fortune didn't get the memo. Audiences laughed, but it was uncomfortable laughter. People did not know whether to pity her or resent her. She was a Hilton. She had access that others did not, yet she was also genuinely struggling. By the 2000s, Francesca was living in low-rent apartments in Los Angeles. She worked odd jobs. She sold personal items to pay bills. She had no health insurance. Her relationship with her mother, Zsa Gabor, deteriorated. Zsa, now in her 90s, was suffering from dementia and was under the care of a controversial conservator, Frederick Prince von Anhalt, her 9th husband. Francesca and Frederick hated each other. Legal battles erupted over Zsa's care and finances. Francesca was shut out. The Hilton family, Baron, his children, the broader clan, did nothing to help her. They were not legally obligated. Conrad's will had been clear, but the moral question hung in the air. Francesca was family. She bore the name, yet she was left to fend for herself. In the early 2010s, Francesca's health began to fail. She developed mobility issues. She suffered from depression. She was often seen around West Hollywood, walking slowly, aged beyond her years, alone. On January 5, 2015, a housekeeper entered Francesca Hilton's small apartment. Francesca was lying on the floor. She had suffered a stroke. She was unresponsive. The housekeeper called 911. Francesca was transported to a hospital, where she died hours later. She was 67 years old. Her body remained unclaimed for several days. There was confusion about who was responsible for her remains. Eventually, her mother's husband, Frederick, arranged for her burial. But the press coverage was minimal. A few tabloids ran stories. Zsa Gabor's daughter found dead. Hilton heiress dies in poverty. But the mainstream media barely noticed. Francesca Hilton, the daughter of a man worth hundreds of millions, died alone in a studio apartment. She had no spouse, no children, no money. Her death is the moral endpoint of the Casa Encantada story. The house was built to prove worth. It passed to a man who believed worth was measured in achievement, not love. That man's philosophy destroyed his children. And the ultimate victim, the one most forgotten, was the girl who wanted nothing more than her father's attention. Francesca never lived in Casa Encantada. She only visited. But the house shaped her life nonetheless. Its cold grandeur, its impossible standards, its message that only greatness mattered, all of this defined the world she grew up in. She was measured against the house and found wanting. She did not fit. She was not grand. She was not a monument. She was human. And the house had no room for humans. 6. The mansion that outlived everyone. Casa Encantada still stands. The address is 2640 Belagio Road, Los Angeles. The current listing price, as of recent years, is $225 million. This makes it the most expensive residential property listing in American history. Since Conrad Hilton's death, the house has changed hands several times. David Murdoch sold it in $2,000 to Gary Winnick, a telecommunications billionaire, for $94 million. Winnick renovated again, spending tens of millions more. In 2019, it returned to the market, priced at $225 million. No one has bought it. The price is too high. The market for homes at that level is infinitesimally small. There are perhaps a few dozen people on Earth who could afford it, and most of them already own multiple properties. Casa Encantada sits, waiting. The house has been stripped of its original soul multiple times. The Rob's John Gibbings furniture is gone, sold at auctions decades ago. The dark walnut paneling is gone, painted over or removed. The rooms have been reconfigured. Modern technology has been installed. The pool has been resurfaced. The gardens have been replanted, but the bones remain: the structure, the H shape, the hilltop location, the underground tunnel. The architecture of isolation. And the ghosts remain. Not literal ghosts. There are no haunting reports, but the psychic residue of the people who suffered here. Hilda Weber, who built it to escape rejection and ended up bankrupt. Conrad Hilton, who bought it to house his dynasty and ended up alone. Nicky, who drank himself to death trying to escape his father's shadow. Francesca, who died poor and forgotten while her surname glittered on facades worldwide. The house consumed them all. It promised grandeur and delivered emptiness. It offered status and produced isolation. It was, in every sense, enchanted, but the enchantment was a curse. 7. What the house teaches us about the American religion of success. The story of Casa Encantada is not just the story of a mansion. It is a parable about America itself, about the religion of success, the mythology of self-made men, the belief that greatness is the highest virtue, and that comfort, love, and emotional connection are weaknesses to be overcome. Hilda Weber and Conrad Hilton were both outsiders. Hilda was a nurse who married into wealth. Conrad was a shopkeeper's son from the frontier. Both of them carried the wound of exclusion. Both believed that achievement could heal that wound. Both were wrong. Hilda built Casa Encantada to force society to accept her. But acceptance cannot be purchased. The house proved her wealth, but wealth alone does not grant belonging. The Cincinnati society she fled never cared about her mansion. The Hollywood elite who attended her parties admired the architecture, but not the woman. She died in debt, evicted from her own monument. Conrad bought the house to consolidate his status as American royalty. He had conquered the hotel industry. Now he needed a palace, but the palace became a prison. His children grew up in rooms designed to impress strangers, not to nurture families. Conrad loved the idea of dynasty, but he hated the messiness of actual human relationships. He thought discipline could replace affection. He was wrong. His eldest son drank himself to death. His daughter died in poverty. His middle son saved the company, but repeated the same emotional mistakes. The curse of Casa Encantada is the curse of American capitalism in its purest form, the belief that material success is the measure of human worth. That belief creates monsters, not comic book villains, but ordinary people so focused on winning that they forget why winning matters. Conrad Hilton was not evil. He was devout, principled, hard-working. He genuinely believed he was doing the right thing by disinheriting his children. He thought he was teaching them resilience. But resilience built on deprivation is not strength, it is trauma. The house itself, in its architectural language, embodies this philosophy. It is designed for display, not for living. Every room is a stage. Every piece of furniture is positioned for maximum visual impact. There are no cozy corners, no intimate spaces. The scale overwhelms. The materials intimidate. The symmetry demands perfection. You cannot raise children in a museum. You cannot build a family in a monument. But Hilda and Conrad both tried, and the house, indifferent and patient, watched them fail. 8. The economics of loneliness. There is a detail in this story that deserves attention: the numbers, the money. Hilda Weber spent the equivalent of over $40 million in today's money-building Casa Encantada. She lost most of her fortune maintaining it and eventually sold it for a fraction of its value. Conrad Hilton bought it for $225,000, roughly $4 million in modern terms. This was a steal. He then lived there for nearly 30 years, from 1950 to 1979. During that time, he continued to expand his business empire. At his death, his personal fortune was $200 million, close to $1 billion today. His company, Hilton Hotels Corporation, was valued in the billions. So what did Casa Encantada cost him? Not much financially. The purchase was a rounding error. The maintenance was covered by the company. The house was, in economic terms, a perfectly rational investment. But in human terms, the cost was incalculable. The house was the stage on which Conrad performed his philosophy of discipline and deprivation. It was the backdrop for the coldness that defined his children's lives. It was the symbol of the dynasty, and when Conrad bequeathed 97% of his fortune to charity, the loss of the house was the loss of the family's anchor. Francesca Hilton's inheritance of $100,000 represented less than 1/20th of 1% of her father's estate. If Conrad had given her just 1%, $2 million, her life would have been completely different. She could have bought a modest home, invested wisely, lived comfortably. She would not have died alone in a studio apartment. But Conrad did not see it that way. For him, the math was moral. Giving Francesca more money would corrupt her. Leaving it to charity would save lives. 1% of his fortune could fund water projects in Africa, saving thousands of people. Why should his daughter's comfort outweigh the lives of strangers? This is the utilitarian calculus at its coldest. The greatest good for the greatest number. Charity over family. The logic is impeccable. The result is monstrous. Because Francesca was not a statistic, she was his daughter, and the message he sent, that strangers were more deserving of his money than she was, destroyed her. Baron Hilton, decades later, ran the same calculation. When he announced in 2007 that he would leave 97% of his fortune to the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation, he was applauded. The press called him generous, noble, selfless. And in a sense, he was. His money will fund programs that help millions. But his grandchildren, including Paris Hilton, who had grown up expecting to inherit billions, were cut out. The fortune they thought was theirs went to strangers. Paris, to her credit, has built her own business empire. She did not collapse like Francesca. But the pattern persists. The Hilton men, for 3 generations now, have believed that family inheritance is poison and charity is virtue. Maybe they are right. But maybe virtue that requires sacrificing your own children is not virtue at all. Maybe it is cowardice dressed in moral language. 9. The underground tunnel and the architecture of escape. One architectural detail of Casa Encantada deserves its own meditation: the underground tunnel. The tunnel connects the mansion's grounds to the Bel Air country club next door. It is roughly 200 feet long, wide enough for golf carts. Its construction was included in the original 1930s plans. Hilda Weber wanted it because she valued privacy and exclusivity above all else. The tunnel meant she could move from her home to the club without ever setting foot on a public street. Think about what this represents. A life so insulated, so removed from the ordinary world that even the act of walking between 2 private properties required a subterranean passage. The tunnel is the physical embodiment of aristocratic isolation. It is a rejection of the street, the sidewalk, the possibility of encountering anyone outside the tribe. Conrad Hilton used the tunnel frequently. He was a member of the Bel Air Country Club. He played golf. He attended dinners. The tunnel allowed him to move between his 2 domains without mingling with the hoi polloi. This is the ultimate privilege, the ability to live in a city yet never touch the city. To exist in a bubble where every surface, every interaction is curated and controlled. But there is a cost to that level of isolation. When you never encounter difference, when you never face inconvenience, when you are never forced to negotiate with the world as it is, you atrophy. You lose the ability to empathize. You lose the ability to adapt. You become brittle. Conrad Hilton was a man who understood markets, logistics, finance. He could negotiate with bankers, suppliers, politicians, but he could not understand his own children. He could not read the signals of emotional distress. He could not see that his daughter needed him, not money. The tunnel is a metaphor for that blindness. He had insulated himself so completely that he was deaf to the human frequencies around him. 10. The curse is not the house, the curse is the idea. Let us be clear about something. Casa Encantada is not haunted. There is no supernatural force at work. The curse is not in the walls. The curse is in the idea that a house can prove your worth, the idea that grandeur equals respect, the idea that material success is the highest form of achievement, the idea that wealth must be protected from heirs because heirs are weak. These ideas killed Nicky Hilton. These ideas impoverished Francesca. These ideas turned Baron into his father. The tragedy is that Conrad Hilton was trying to do good. He was not a sadist. He did not take pleasure in his children's suffering. He genuinely believed that deprivation would make them stronger. He looked at families destroyed by inherited wealth, Vanderbilts, Astors, Guggenheims, and saw a pattern. Money corrupted, idleness rotted, so he withheld. But he confused financial discipline with emotional abandonment. He thought that by making his children fend for themselves financially, he was teaching resilience. He did not see that resilience requires a foundation of security. A child who is loved unconditionally can handle hardship. A child who is conditionally loved, who is only valued for their achievements, becomes brittle. They crack. Nicky cracked. Francesca cracked. Baron survived by becoming his father, which is its own form of death. The house witnessed all of this, but the house did not cause it. The house was just a mirror. It reflected the values of its owners. When those values were cold, the house was cold. When those values prioritized grandeur over intimacy, the house became a museum. Casa Encantada is still for sale. $225 million. No takers. It sits empty most of the year, maintained by staff who ensure the gardens remain perfect and the marble remains polished. The house waits for the next buyer, the next billionaire who believes that owning the most expensive home in America will prove something about their worth. And maybe the next owner will be different. Maybe they will fill the rooms with laughter and chaos and the mess of actual life. Maybe they will turn it into a home. But history suggests otherwise. The house was designed for display, and display is what it does best. Conclusion: what cannot be bought? There is a photograph of Conrad Hilton from the mid-1970s, taken in the library of Casa Encantada. He is sitting in one of Rob's John Gibbings's custom chairs, the one with lion's paw feet. He is dressed impeccably, dark suit, white shirt, tie perfectly knotted. His hair is white, combed back. His face is lined but strong. His eyes are sharp. Behind him, the English walnut paneling glows in the lamplight. Leather-bound books line the shelves. Everything in the frame is expensive, tasteful, controlled. But if you look at Conrad's face, you see something else: loneliness. The photograph captures a man who has everything and nothing. He is 87 years old in this picture. His empire spans the globe. His name is synonymous with hospitality. He has achieved everything he set out to achieve. But he is alone. His eldest son is dead. His daughter is estranged. His other children visit out of obligation, not love. He sits in a house with 64 rooms, and there is no one to share them with. The photograph does not lie. This is the truth of Casa Encantada. You can build the most expensive house in the world. You can fill it with art and antiques and architectural perfection. But you cannot buy warmth. You cannot purchase intimacy. You cannot construct love. Conrad Hilton died believing he had done the right thing. He left his fortune to charity. He funded projects that have saved lives, provided clean water, supported education. The Conrad N. Hilton Foundation is one of the most effective charitable organizations in the world. His legacy, in that sense, is secure. But his children? His daughter died poor. His son died drunk. His grandchildren inherited trauma disguised as discipline. Was it worth it? The question is not rhetorical. Conrad himself must have asked it in the final days. Lying in that hospital bed, machines beeping, breath shallow. Did he regret the coldness? Did he wish he had held his daughter one more time? Did he think about Nicky, the golden boy, and wonder if a little more patience, a little more forgiveness might have saved him? We do not know. Conrad left no deathbed confession. His will spoke for him, and the will was clear. The mission matters more than the family. Casa Encantada stands as the monument to that choice. The house that destroyed the Hilton. Dynasty is not a ruin. It is pristine, it is perfect, it is worth $250 million. But it is empty, and it always has been. If there is a lesson in this story, it is not a simple one. It is not money is bad or charity is cold. The lesson is more nuanced. It is this: greatness and goodness are not the same thing. You can be great and still fail at the things that matter most. You can change the world and still lose your family. You can build monuments that last centuries and still die alone. Conrad Hilton was great, but he was not good, not to the people who needed him most. And Casa Encantada, the house he bought to prove his dynasty, became instead its tomb. The enchantment was always an illusion. Behind the marble and walnut, behind the crystal and silk, there was only this: a man who could not love and a family who could not escape. The house is still for sale, $225 million. But no price can undo the past. No buyer can exorcise the ghosts. Casa Encantada will remain what it has always been, the most expensive monument to loneliness ever built. And somewhere in the archives of forgotten tabloids, there is an obituary for Francesca Hilton, daughter of Conrad, granddaughter of no one who cared, dead at 67, alone, poor, forgotten. She wanted only one thing her whole life: not money, not the house, just her father's love, and he never gave it to her. Because in the arithmetic of his world, her need did not outweigh the needs of strangers. That is the true curse of Casa Encantada, not the house itself, but the philosophy that built it, the belief that the abstract good matters more than the particular human being standing in front of you, asking for nothing more than to be seen. Conrad Hilton saw the world, but he never saw his daughter, and that blindness cost more than all the marble in Bel Air. Part 2. The architecture of ambition and the engineering of estrangement. What they don't tell you about houses like Casa Encantada is this: they are not built to be lived in. They are built to make statements. And the statement Casa Encantada made, from the moment Hilda Weber signed off on those blueprints in 1936 until the day Francesca Hilton died in obscurity 79 years later, was the same unforgiving declaration: you are not enough. Let us dig deeper into the mechanics of this curse. Not the supernatural variety that Hollywood prefers, but the far more insidious kind, the curse of architecture that shapes psychology, of spaces that warp the souls of those who inhabit them. 1. The psychology of scale, how big houses make small people. There exists a branch of environmental psychology dedicated to understanding how physical spaces influence human behavior. The findings are unambiguous. When you place a person in a space too large for their emotional needs, something breaks. Casa Encantada measured approximately 40,000 square feet across its various structures. To put this in perspective, the average American home in 1950, when Conrad Hilton took possession, was roughly 980 square feet. This means Casa Encantada was 40 times larger than what most Americans considered adequate for an entire family. But raw square footage tells only part of the story. The true psychological weapon was the ceiling height, 12 feet in the main halls, 14 in the ballroom. These dimensions were not arbitrary. Hilda Weber and James Dolina deliberately created proportions that made human beings look diminished. Stand in a room with 14-foot ceilings and you instinctively understand this space was not designed for you. It was designed for gods, emperors, or at minimum, people far more important than you currently are. Conrad Hilton understood this dynamic intellectually. He used it in his hotels. The lobbies of Hilton properties were always grand, always towering, specifically to make guests feel they had entered a realm of importance. But what works as theater for temporary guests becomes toxicity for permanent residents. His children, Nikki, Baron, Eric, and Francesca, grew up under those ceilings. Every day they woke up, every meal they ate, every conversation they attempted occurred in spaces that whispered constantly, "You must become enormous to fill this void." Nikki responded by trying to become enormous through spectacle. The parties, the gambling, the celebrity marriage. He was attempting to generate enough noise, enough drama, to fill the acoustic void of those marble halls. Baron responded through submission and competence. If he could not be emotionally large enough, he would become functionally indispensable. He made himself into his father's perfect instrument. Francesca, born later, watching both her half-brothers struggle, seems to have understood the futility earlier. She never tried to fill the space. She recognized it as enemy territory and spent most of her life trying to escape it. The architectural theorist Christopher Alexander wrote extensively about what he called the pattern language, the idea that buildings communicate through their structure, teaching us how to behave. Casa Encantada's pattern language was brutally clear. Individual comfort is irrelevant. Only grandeur matters. 2. The economics of maintenance. Why this house was always a trap. Here is the mathematical reality that destroyed both Hilda Weber and eventually constrained even Conrad Hilton. A house of this scale does not simply cost money to build. It hemorrhages money to operate. In 1938, when Casa Encantada opened, Hilda Weber employed a permanent staff of 30 people. Let us itemize what that meant. 6 gardeners working full-time to maintain the grounds, which included not just lawns but formal English gardens, a rose garden with over 200 varieties, and topiary that required constant trimming. 4 housekeepers managing the 64 rooms, ensuring not a single surface gathered dust. 3 cooks, because a house of this stature required not just meals, but cuisine, and different members of the household ate at different times with different requirements. 2 chauffeurs, as the wealthy did not drive themselves. Personal maids and valets for Hilda and any guests. A house manager coordinating all operations. Security personnel. Maintenance specialists for the pool, the heating systems, the electrical infrastructure. The annual payroll for this staff, adjusted for inflation, would exceed $1.5 million in today's currency. This does not include the costs of utilities, heating 40,000 square feet, cooling it in summer, lighting those crystal chandeliers, or the costs of repairs, which in a house using the finest materials are exponentially higher than in ordinary construction. When Conrad Hilton bought the property in 1950, he inherited this operational burden. He had the wealth to sustain it, certainly. At his peak, he could have run 10 such households without noticing the expense. But the psychological burden was different. Hilton built his fortune on operational efficiency. Every Hilton hotel was a model of cost optimization. He measured everything: the cost per towel, the electricity consumption per room, the labor hours per bed made. His genius was in systematizing hospitality, making it predictable and profitable. But Casa Encantada resisted systematization. It was inherently inefficient. You could not standardize the maintenance of 18th-century antique furniture. You could not optimize the care of hand-carved walnut paneling. The house demanded artisanal attention, which meant expensive, unpredictable labor. This created a psychological dissonance in Hilton's mind. He lived in the one asset he could not make profitable. The house was not generating revenue. It was pure expense, pure consumption. For a man whose identity was built on turning profit, this was intolerable. His children lived in this peculiar tension, surrounded by visible wealth that their father, despite his billions, resented spending on them. They had everything, the finest linens, the perfectly maintained gardens, the Olympic pool. But they understood at a visceral level that every dollar spent on their comfort was, in their father's mind, a dollar wasted. This is why the Christmas checks for $100 were so devastating. It was not the amount itself, it was the message. You cost me so much just by existing in this house that I will not give you 1 penny more than necessary. 3. The spatial geography of emotional distance. Let us return to that underground tunnel connecting Casa Encantada to the Bel Air Country Club. On the surface, it was a convenience, a covered passage allowing residents to move between home and club without exposure to weather or public observation. But tunnels are powerful symbols in architecture. They represent hidden connections, secret movements, the infrastructure of privilege that remains invisible to outsiders. Conrad Hilton used that tunnel regularly. He would walk through it to the club for business lunches, for golf, for meetings with other titans of industry. The tunnel allowed him to move from one realm of power to another without ever touching the ordinary world. But consider what this meant for his children. They watched their father disappear underground, moving toward a world of adult concerns, deals, politics, the machinery of empire, while they remained above in the domestic realm, which he clearly regarded as secondary. The tunnel became a physical manifestation of his priorities. The important conversations, the real business of life, happened at the other end of that passage. The house was merely the place you slept, the expensive backdrop you maintained because it projected the right image. Francesca Hilton, in one of her rare interviews in the 1990s, mentioned this tunnel. She described being a child and begging to go through it with her father to the club. He always refused. Children were not permitted at the Bel Air Country Club except on designated family days. The tunnel, she said, represented everything she could not have: her father's time, his attention, entry into his real world. The cruelty was not intentional. Conrad Hilton was not a sadist. He was simply a man whose life was organized around clear hierarchies. Business was sacred. Family was important, but secondary. And when those two obligations conflicted, business won. Always. The architecture of Casa Encantada reinforced this hierarchy. The house had formal spaces, the library, the dining room, the ballroom, where important people were entertained. And it had domestic spaces, the children's bedrooms, the breakfast room, the back stairs used by servants, where the messy business of daily life occurred. Hilton spent most of his time in the formal spaces or in his private office. His children inhabited the margins. 4. The curse propagates. Baron Hilton and the repetition compulsion. The most psychologically fascinating aspect of the Casa Encantada curse is how Baron Hilton, who spent 9 years fighting his father's will, who explicitly rejected the idea that children should be disinherited for their own good, eventually replicated the exact same pattern. In 2007, Baron announced he would bequeath 97% of his fortune, $2.3 billion, to the Conrad and Hilton Foundation. His grandchildren, including Paris and Nicky Hilton, would receive only token amounts. Why? How does a man who experienced the pain of financial rejection inflict the same pain on the next generation? The answer lies in what psychologists call identification with the aggressor. Baron spent his entire adult life trying to prove himself to his father. Even after Conrad's death, Baron was still performing for an audience of one, by ultimately doing what his father did, choosing the foundation over blood heirs. Baron was saying, "You were right, Father. I finally understand." But there is a deeper economic logic at work, too. Both Conrad and Baron understood something fundamental about generational wealth. It usually destroys more than it creates. The statistics are unambiguous. 70% of wealthy families lose their wealth by the second generation. 90% lose it by the third. The mechanisms of destruction are predictable. Lack of motivation, substance abuse, poor investment decisions, exploitation by predators attracted to wealth. Conrad had watched this pattern repeatedly in the families around him. The Vanderbilt fortune, once the largest in America, was completely dissipated by the fourth generation. Not a single Vanderbilt descendant by 1970 was wealthy enough to attend the first Vanderbilt family reunion. So Conrad made a calculated decision. Better to give the money to professionals who would deploy it systematically to solve global problems than to hand it to children who would waste it on houses they did not need and lifestyles that would hollow them out from within. Baron, after decades running Hilton hotels, had seen enough trust fund disasters to reach the same conclusion. The money was safer with the foundation than with heirs who had not earned it. The tragedy is that this logic, however sound in aggregate, destroyed individual human beings. Francesca Hilton did not squander her inheritance. She never received one. She died poor not because she was irresponsible, but because her father preemptively decided she would be. 5. Casa Encantada. After the Hiltons, the house as perpetual record breaker. The house itself continued its strange career as the most expensive piece of real estate in Los Angeles, changing hands in transactions that each reset the ceiling for residential property values. David Murdoch paid $12.4 million in 1980. Gary Winnick paid $94 million in 2000. In 2019, the property was listed for $225 million, though it failed to sell at that price and was eventually withdrawn. Each new owner attempted to impose their vision. Murdoch, as mentioned, gutted the Rob's John Gibbings interiors. Winnick brought in new designers, installed modern technology, converted sections of the house to accommodate contemporary tastes. But here is the strange pattern. None of these subsequent owners stayed long. The average tenure was less than a decade. For a house of this significance, purchased at record prices, this is anomalous. When you pay nearly $100 million for a home, you typically plan to remain there for life. Why the rapid turnover? Real estate analysts cited various reasons: changing markets, financial pressures, business relocations. But there is another possibility, one that ventures into territory skeptics will dismiss, but which nonetheless warrants consideration. The house might simply be unsuitable for human happiness. Not in a supernatural sense, but in the way certain buildings, because of their scale and demands, extract more energy than they provide. Living in Casa Encantada requires perpetual performance. You cannot relax in a museum. You cannot be simply human in a monument. Every day you wake up in that master bedroom, you are reminded you must be worthy of this space. You must live at a level of formality and grandeur that matches the architecture. Most people cannot sustain that. Billionaires, accustomed to luxury, still crave moments of ordinary comfort. They want to walk barefoot on carpet without worrying about damaging priceless antiques. They want to eat pizza in front of the television without servants hovering. Casa Encantada does not permit ordinariness. It is architecturally opposed to relaxation. And so, after a few years, even the wealthiest owners find themselves exhausted by the demands of the house and move on to something more manageable. 6. The Hilton grandchildren. When the curse becomes farce. The ultimate irony of the Hilton dynasty is that the great-grandchildren, Conrad's descendants through Baron's son Richard, became famous precisely by embracing everything Conrad despised. Paris Hilton emerged in the early 2000s as the avatar of heiress culture, conspicuous consumption, manufactured celebrity, wealth without productivity. She was not running hotels, she was not building empires, she was being photographed at nightclubs and producing reality television. Conrad Hilton would have been appalled. This was his nightmare scenario, a descendant trading on the family name while contributing nothing of substance. But from another perspective, Paris Hilton was the inevitable result of the family's emotional dynamics. She was not raised with the expectation that she would inherit serious money. Barron had already announced the fortune was going to the foundation. Paris knew she was on her own, so she built her own brand. She monetized her image, her name, her persona. She created a business empire, fragrances, accessories, media ventures, worth hundreds of millions. She did, in fact, become a businesswoman, though in a mode so distant from her great-grandfather's world that he would not have recognized it as legitimate work. The tragedy and the comedy collide here. Conrad tried to teach his descendants that money must be earned. He withheld inheritance to force them to be self-sufficient. And in Paris's case, it worked, but in a way that made a mockery of his values. She earned her fortune through precisely the kind of frivolous celebrity culture he would have despised. Meanwhile, Francesca, who tried to earn her living through comedy and acting, who actually attempted to build something outside the family name, died in poverty. The universe's sense of justice is often perverse. 7. What the house teaches: the limits of material perfection. If there is a lesson encoded in the walls of Casa Encantada, it is this: perfection in the material realm creates imperfection in the human realm. Hilda Weber wanted perfection. Every surface, every angle, every fixture was chosen to create an environment of flawless beauty. She achieved it, and it destroyed her financially and emotionally. Conrad Hilton wanted to live in that perfection, to use it as the headquarters of his empire. He achieved it, and it became the stage for the disintegration of his family. Every subsequent owner wanted to possess the ultimate trophy property. They achieved it, and none of them could bear to stay. The house is not cursed in any mystical sense. It is cursed by simple human limitation. We are not built to live in perfection. We are messy, emotional, inconsistent creatures who need spaces that accommodate our flaws. A house with 64 rooms, where every room is a masterpiece, leaves no room for the merely good enough. It demands that every moment of your life meet the standard set by the architecture, and that is an impossible burden. Conrad Hilton built an empire by understanding exactly what people needed in temporary shelter: cleanliness, comfort, consistency, efficiency. His hotels were not palaces. They were predictable, reliable machines for rest. But in his personal life, he made the opposite choice. He bought spectacle when he needed sanctuary. He chose grandeur over warmth. And the architecture of Casa Encantada, magnificent as it was, could not provide what he actually needed: a place where he could be small, vulnerable, and fully human. His children, forced to grow up in that environment, were shaped by its values. They learned that appearance mattered more than feeling, that public image trumped private truth, that the machine of reputation must always be maintained, whatever the personal cost. When Francesca died alone in that West Hollywood apartment, she was the final casualty of a house built 80 years earlier. The architectural choices Hilda Weber made in 1936, the scale, the formality, the insistence on perfection, rippled forward through decades, shaping lives, warping relationships, defining what the Hilton name meant to those who carried it. The house stands today, waiting for its next owner, its next chapter. It will outlast all of us. Stone and steel endure longer than flesh, but whether any human being will ever truly inhabit it, will ever make it a home rather than a monument, remains an open question. Perhaps some spaces are simply not meant to be homes. Perhaps Casa Encantada is exactly what it was always meant to be: a warning, cast in marble and walnut, about the price of perfection and the architecture of ambition. We have now examined the deeper mechanisms of the Casa Encantada curse, the psychology, the economics, the spatial dynamics that made this house a destroyer of families rather than a shelter for them. But there remain questions about the broader implications, about what this story tells us about wealth, family, and the American dream itself. Those themes deserve their own extended exploration.